maybe I'm kind of suspicious of this whole, minimalist guide, and I'm also very suspicious of lazy DBAs. So Tom, you've got the slides. Can you advance the slides? There you go. That's me. I've already had an introduction. My big thing is the reason I'm talking about DBAs is I want you to love data, and I'd also love to friend you or follow you or Facebook you, whatever that means. And those are the ways to contact me, and we will make these handouts available, so no need to write this down quickly. Tom, what about you?
Oh, what about me? I already had a good introduction. You don't need to hear more. I will say, though, that first of all, in case anybody can't hear me, let me know in the Q&A section if my voice is coming through okay. I don't think you should love your data right away. I think you and your data should just be friends for a while first. Rushing into love with your data, I just think is a bad idea. So as I mentioned, I work for Compio Software, technical evangelist for them, makers of Ignite 8, Ignite VM. And he said all sorts of other good things about me. There's some information. You can find out how to reach me. So, Karen, why are we going to talk about this today?
Actually, I was going to ask you that.
Oh, okay. So, a while back, I had this idea for a blog post about how it would be helpful for people who were new to being database administrators or the accidental DBA. They always have that question, like, where do I begin? What should I do first? And my idea was sort of this Zen-like thing that you should have this minimalist concept and be able to focus on just the bare bones essentials for you to do your job effectively. And I put together a list, I put together a blog post, and Steve had the idea that I should probably do this for the fundamentals virtual chapter. So the question is really, as a DBA, where do I begin? And the list I put together not only is for somebody new, but it's really a good list for even if you have years of experience. There are certain things that you need to have that are fundamental to your job that I think sometimes people drift away from, or they just get comfortable and they kind of forget that these are things that the core competencies that they really need.
So not just for newbies. This isn't an introduction to DBA activities. I guess I can't. So it's things that people should keep enhancing and keep working on all throughout their career?
Absolutely, because as technology changes, you can lose sight of what might be crucial to your role, because you get comfortable that you've done things in a certain way for a certain period of time. But you need to be up to date on certain things and remember where your mission really is. And I think it's beneficial for people, say, old and new.
That's great. In the whole flying business, they have this concept of fly the plane. That's your #1 job. And when things go wrong, sometimes people forget to actually fly the plane while they're trying to fix things. So I think that's a great, I think this is going to be a great topic. So what are we going to do today?
So we'll bicker about database administration for about 45 minutes.
Just 45 minutes?
Yeah. But by bicker, we're going to, actually, it's not really a debate today, is it?
Not really.
Okay. And so this is the full agenda. So we're going to talk about this for about 45 minutes. And you can ask questions as we go. And if something is very pertinent, we'll probably just stop where we are and answer that question. We're likely going to end up answering the questions at the end. And we'll go over some minimal stuff and hand out some tips and some resources at the end. We ready?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So Karen, what do you think is the #1 thing a DBA has to do?
Make their data architects happy?
No. So the #1 thing that a DBA really has to be able to do, right? Your priority as a DBA is going to be focused on make sure you have backups. Okay. I'm sorry. Your priority is to recover data. Okay. If you can't recover data, you are fairly useless as a database administrator. That is your #1 goal. So the only way to recover data is if you're doing backups. So if you're showing up and it's day 1, the first thing you're going to want to do is make sure that those databases are being backed up properly.
But we don't really need backups, I say. We need restores, right? Who cares about the backups?
Well, you can't. What are you going to restore from? I mean, if you can recreate your entire data source, then I guess you don't need a backup. And we'll actually talk about that a little bit later. We have a slide where we talk about the differences between high availability and disaster recovery. But if you can't restore without a backup, right, you've got to have a backup. There's just no way about it. So, and you need to find the right tool for managing and administration your backup plan.
Oh, well, I know that answer. That answer is PowerShell, right? PowerShell does your
No,
backup for you.
no, not necessarily. So there's a couple of easy ways. Oops, sorry, I went too far. There's a couple of easy ways. One, and I see most common, is the use of maintenance plans. Maintenance plans will get the job done for backups. They really will. I find maintenance plans a fairly useful tool, especially for new administrators that have just a handful of instances that are under their care. So we're talking half a dozen instances. You probably go and you manually create some maintenance plans and you walk your way through the wizard and you figure out how your backups are getting done. Just doing a maintenance plan is better than the alternative, which you see a lot where people simply aren't doing any backup whatsoever. But in addition to maintenance plans, and usually this is where people, you know, you mentioned PowerShell. A lot of times people come over and they say, yeah, I'm just going to use PowerShell for everything these days. But a maintenance plan can allow for some granularity that PowerShell may not provide out of the box, and it's quite a lot of extra coding for you. So what you end up doing is you find that maintenance plans kind of have a nice little niche, like I said, half a dozen servers or so. When you start getting more and more servers under your care, these maintenance plans don't necessarily work as well. They don't scale as easily, right? So that's where you start getting into things like PowerShell, or in this case, I point out Ola Hallengren's scripts. If you're not familiar with these scripts, they're a set of maintenance scripts. They'll do backups, alter index, all sorts of good stuff for you. And I always point people to these scripts simply because I find them to be the most valuable scripts out there. They're free. Ola's not out trying to, he's not doing this as a side business or anything. It's completely free. He keeps them up to date. He's done a wonderful job. They've been around for years. They're very stable. Most people I know, respected MVPs and MCMs, they point people to Ola as well. So if you haven't seen these scripts yet, you should.
I remember when I first came across these, like before I was an active part of the SQL Server community, and I found these, and they were so well done. You could tell, like, I write scripting for all kinds of things because I'm a little bit lazy, and I've seen how these have changed over the years as more and more features, sort of this incremental refinement of them, and you know, people just have to mention Ola's name and say, oh yeah, those are the scripts, right?
Yep, exactly. And the scripts, these offer advantages over management packs. Again, it's granularity and control. What I find is great for the scripts is it's something you can easily deploy to a lot of servers at once, and you could use PowerShell to start deploying things like this. So once you know your backups are in place, then you're ready to serve your company in your true capacity, which is your ability to recover data, right? Restores. This is where you earn your bread and butter as a DBA. This is truly the #1 priority, right? If you can't recover, then you need to update your resume. That's the simple truth. If your company has had some sort of disaster like this, a broken base, right? If you have some sort of disaster and you can't recover, they're going to go find somebody who can. So recovery is your mission. And in order to get it done, you're going to need some practice. You want to practice restoring. You want to make sure that your recovery process is sound. You want to do some testing. You want to do end-to-end testing. You want to test your tape recovery process too. So if somebody says, oh, don't worry about the backups, it's server tape, they're shipped off-site, we can go back for years, not a problem. You know what? One day, just recall the tape. Say, give me something from 6 months ago and see if you can recover, see how long it takes. It might take a couple of days to get the right tape, things of that nature. You want to test and practice as much as possible. One thing that had happened to me years ago was the backups were being written to a disk, and that disk filled up, and even though the server team was alerted of a full disk, they didn't realize the value of that, and I actually didn't have an alert for a full disk on that particular server at the time. So my backups weren't actually happening. So I had to put together a little script that would tell me if my backups were current and available. It's actually one of the first things I ever blogged about over at SQL Server Central. And as the years went on and I got more and more servers under my care, I realized that the only way, or I guess I should ask you the question, Karen, how do you verify if a backup is actually good?
I'm assuming someone has a tool out there, but I think the best way is probably just try to restore it, right?
Exactly. That's the only way for you to know if the backup is truly good is for you to restore it. So in my care, I had about 3,000 databases. I certainly wasn't going to restore all 3,000 every day. So a long time ago, I put together an idea about how I could use sampling. And I could just pull out a random number of databases on any given day, sample those, and if I could restore that sample, then I was 95% confident that all of my restores were good. Another little post I put together over at Simple Talk a few years back.
So using math and statistics and those sort of things to try to make sure that, because you can't test everything, so you're just testing part of it and trying to come up with a confidence level of how good all of your backups are?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. That's kind of smart. That's a math thing, right?
It's kind of smart. It's a math thing, yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things you hit upon that I also see a lot of is I've seen DBAs, making sure the backups are taken, and then at one place I worked, then all those tapes were just stacked in a hallway where practically anyone, even in the public, could get to them, or people could move them around or borrow them or whatever. So I consider also ensuring the security and the availability of the backups to be the DBA's job, or do you think it's someone else's job, like the compliance officer or sysadmins or something?
So you're talking about the security of the physical backup tapes, yeah?
Or hard drives or servers or any
Yeah.
place they go to.
So in my experience, that falls to somebody that would be traditionally on the server team and not necessarily a database administrator. I always tell people, as a database administrator, I essentially administer a tiny piece of software. It runs as a service on top of an operating system that is backed by hardware. And I'm not really the person that is taking care of that hardware. I'm not backing up the server to tape. I'm not securing the hard drives and things of that nature. So in my role as a DBA, I actually didn't have access to the server room, probably a good thing too. But if I can't access the server room, then I don't really think I'd be the person responsible for the security of these tapes. But yeah, I've seen them stacked up in the hallway in people's cubes. I've seen tapes, and I've seen the guys just sort of sorting through it, looking for the one that they kind of need that day, and the rest of them are laying around. Yeah, it can get a little iffy sometimes. Somebody could easily just walk up, grab that. You don't know what's on it, and it's not exactly what I would call a best practice.
Yeah, so I think maybe it's not a DBA responsibility, but maybe it's a professional responsibility to go find out what the process is and make comments if the backups aren't secure. Because I've seen databases that are locked down tighter than a drum, but all the data that comes out of them, either in backups or spreadsheets, is just free and open and public. And I always wondered, why lock down the database so much if you're going to let the data just run wild and free?
Yep, and we still don't even know what happens on the back end. And for all we know, it sits on a loading dock for a few days, right?
Yeah, scary stuff.
All right, so we talked backups, we talked restores. Once your recovery strategy is secured, right, then you can turn your focus to the next piece here. Let me advance. There it is, monitoring.
Oh,
monitoring.
A chart.
Right.
That's
yeah,
cool.
Chart. I know, pretty. So you need to know, you have to know what it is you need to measure, okay? You don't want to try to capture everything, although that is usually people's first instinct. Remember, this is about being minimalist, right? If you think that you're just going to be able to capture absolutely every last metric possible in an effort, just in case something goes wrong at some point, all right, I'm here to tell you that it's just not the way to get started. Okay, you need to know what it is you have to measure right away. There's a core set of metrics, right, that you can gather. They're not going to get you to solve everything. And what's going to happen is, as good as you try to make a system to begin with, you end up modifying it over time for whatever it is your shop actually needs, right?
Yeah. So what are the things that people should monitor?
Well, one example is something simple is they do database size, right? You could do CPU utilization. You could do, I have procedure cache hit ratio. That's another common metric that you could gather. I think there's a better question. It's not exactly what it is you want, because again, every shop is different, right? And depending on how shops are set up, there are some core metrics you want, but every shop is different. The better question for you to ask yourself, right, is not what, but how often, how frequent do I need to monitor for something? Remember I talked about if you're trying to capture absolutely everything, that's something that's more akin to, say, tracing. And tracing can introduce a little bit more overhead than what you would like, especially on the production server. So besides tracing, another method is what we call polling. And so you have to figure out which one of those is actually more suited for what it is you're trying to do. So I put the definitions here for which one's which, right?
Ah, definitions, those are good. Data architects love definitions.
Right. So tracing, you have to figure out which one's best for your need. Tracing is more of actively tracking the details, capturing the events as they happen, right? Polling is where you do sampling. So do I need to know what the CPU utilization is every second of the day? Likely not. I would tell you 2 minutes would be good enough for you to know what the CPU, 5 minutes would probably be good enough for me. I wouldn't need to know down to the 1 second level of detail what CPU utilization would be.
Might that vary by base of what applications and uses for the server or the database are?
Say that again. Would I?
Might how often you monitor or trace vary based on what the application is or what the server is being used for?
Right. So I guess I didn't understand your Canadian accent. So monitor or trace. So some of the things you can look at, say another one is like database size or hard drive space left. Is that something you have to monitor every second of the day? No. That's something you might poll, once or twice a day to have an idea of what the space looks like. But if you're thinking about tracing, I usually think of tracing as sort of a diagnostic thing. And so if there's an issue you need to resolve, then you want to consider tracing, and that's when you want to have go a little more heavy on a lot of the metrics you're trying to capture as they're happening, and you want to do that for a short as duration as necessary in order for you to help resolve the problem. You don't want to be tracing all day long simply because you can. I've seen systems that essentially do that. They set up traces, they let them run all day, and they think it's great. If there's ever a problem, they can go back and review all that data. I think that's a little too heavy. Most problems can be solved through simple polling of the metrics involved, and with your experience, you can start to piece together what's really happening.
Because there's a cost here, right? A trade-off for doing these things. Both polling and tracing consume resources, and if you're doing it on production, impact production, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's a trade-off. The method that my company uses is more of a poll, right? As a matter of fact, everything we do is polling. We don't do any sort of tracing whatsoever, because we want to be as lightweight as possible. Tracing has its merits, but only in a handful of circumstances. I prefer the polling method. It's also pretty important if you have. If your servers are virtualized, you're running VMware, then you got a whole different set of counters you want. You don't want just like CPU utilization for the instance, but you want to know for the host as well. You also want to know if the guest is waiting to get an available processor from the host. So there's a lot of different metrics involved if you're virtual as well. Lots of information. Matter of fact, we could probably do a whole nother talk on this.
That's just what I was going to say. There's probably a whole nother talk and maybe a couple of blog posts about these things.
Yeah, probably. So we talk backups, restores, monitoring, and monitoring is good, right? But you're going to need to know when things go wrong, right? It's not just about monitoring itself, but you're going to want to pay attention to when you're going to need some sort of method of alerting. And this is the important thing, only alert yourself when action is needed. Everything else is just white noise.
Yeah, like that. In the upper right there, that's my those 1,457 meeting invites is actually a problem on my calendar integration on my phone. So now I just ignore that big alert that says, oh, you have a new calendar entry, because I don't want to go through those almost 1,500 alerts to find the ones that are real versus just duplicates over and over again.
And the reason you can't just delete them and start over?
Oh, so I can on my phone, and it's one by agonizing one, almost rebar to it, and then they just come back again because something's integrating with my calendar and posting things over and over again. So I have to go figure that out. But what it means is that if I don't see an alert pop up like an actual pop-up alert, which is very intrusive when I'm working, then that little badge there that hangs on my calendar entry that says 1500, I just ignore it completely. So if there was a really important meeting notice coming in there, I'd miss it because it wouldn't just say 1 or 2 there. So it's really noise to me now. That alert.
Sounds like a Canadian problem.
So, using Apple.
But, you know, the real thing I've seen people do, though, is they alert themselves on the success. I mean, I've seen people flat out, they go, that batch load should finish about 9:15. I'll send myself an alert. They, way back, right, they'd have this pager. They go, at 9:15, this thing better go off. That way I know things are okay. And I just looked at them, I go, why would you ever want to be interrupted or think to yourself, oh, in the middle of dinner, I'm out with friends, and that pager better go off. I'm like, that's a horrible way to go through life. Notify you when action is needed and nothing else.
The feedback we get in a day is, oh, something worked.
Yeah, so things are supposed to work. You know, it should be the exception. And so if you're going to start into this role, or if you've fallen into a role, or if you're experienced and you've all of a sudden wake up one day and go, wow, why am I notifying myself for something that's successful? It's kind of silly. It might have some value if you're debugging or developing, but not for production support. Not at all.
Actually, that's a good point, because, you know, it's like when I'm developing something, you know, you want to put in some of those, okay, this worked, that worked, okay, this failed, so that you can tell where something's failing. So I think positive alerts are good in certain circumstances. The hard part is that it's like email notification. If you get 1,000 new emails a day, having something pop up in the, you know, bottom right of your screen saying, hey, you have a new email, hey, you have a new email. You know, I don't use those anymore because I get 1,000 emails a day. But from a certain set of people, like my clients and my cats, I do have an alert pop up. It's just a manual rule that's highly filtered.
And one thing to also keep in mind is that whatever system you're setting up for alerting and notification, you need redundancy for this system. You must monitor the monitor. Okay. If you don't monitor the monitor, you run the risk of never knowing that your alerting is working or not. So that's an important thing to put into. And you need to test your alerting process, right? Just make sure that it works every now and then as expected. The other important piece of advice is if you get an alert, like you have those 1,457, if you don't know what they're for, you need to find out. Now, you assume you know what all of those are for. Well, that's fine. I trust your experience with this. But if you get an alert, if you ever get something, you're handed a new system, you get an alert, and you have no idea what the alert is, don't ignore it. You need to take the time to go figure out what it is. If the alert has no value, right, if it's just noise, then turn it off. Make sure you don't get alerted again. You don't want to be interrupted unnecessarily. But if you don't understand it, if it's just a bunch of garbage, you're looking at this thing, you say, I have no idea, it must not be for me, that's wrong. If you're the one on call, if you're getting the email, if you're getting paged, whatever, if you're getting an alert notification and you don't understand it, you need to go find and ask some questions and make sure you understand what's happening, and then see if the alert has value or not. And if it doesn't, turn it off.
Yeah, good point.
So we've talked, oh God, a whole bunch of stuff, backups, restores, monitoring, alerting. It does sound like a lot, right? And again, we talked about this being a minimalist thing. These are the bare minimums I would tell anybody that they need to make sure that they have a hold of. It can be overwhelming. So this is the point when things get a little overwhelming, you start to talk to yourself about automation.
There's a space picture here.
Yeah, I wonder who put that space picture in the Canada arm. So an example of automation we've actually already talked about would be backups, because I doubt you're doing them by hand.
This is where PowerShell comes in, right? Automation?
Yes, yes. So you need to think about all the ways that you can possibly scale yourself. That's what automation is. Whatever you're doing for one instance and now you need to do for 180 instances, you need to think about the ways you can scale yourself. So policy-based management is one possible solution. Another thing is that a lot of times you're handed a system or you fall into a system that has things that are already scripted out or maybe not. I would tell you to do an incremental automation. Don't try to automate everything at once. Pick one thing, automate that, make sure you're monitoring it and you have the alerting, and then move on to the next one. The other thing to point out is incremental enhancements, right? And what I mean is you don't rewrite everything just because you can. PowerShell may be the answer, but that doesn't mean you're going to spend days, weeks, months rewriting every last thing you have in PowerShell just because you can.
So the best DBA is a lazy DBA?
Absolutely. Absolutely. What you really want is someone who's driven to be as lazy as possible. That's the best DBA.
We need t-shirts for that.
But it's true. You want somebody that recognizes that there's a need, right? Something has to get done, backup, restore, whatever, monitoring something. It has to get done. It has to get done at scale. And they don't want to be clicking buttons all day long. They don't want to have to do a lot of manual intervention. So they're lazy. They don't want to do all this. It's like, hey, are you going to make 2 trips with the garbage? No, I'm going to do it in 1 trip. You want that person, that's the perfect DBA. You want to do things, you're going to do it once, and you're going to move on with your life. So the best DBA is a lazy DBA.
I think that's really true because I see the same thing even on the data architect, data modeling side and developer DBA. I mean, I see people who are doing an easy job that requires really no human thought process other than clicking buttons. I mean, the example I use on the data modeler side is, to print all the 100 models, submodels in your model. In most tools is a manual process. You open up the submodel, you orient the page, you move some things around, and you hit print. And you do that over and over again. It can take hours to do them all. So if you can automate that, something that's just, a batch job, you should do that to sort of free up your time to focus on the things where your brain is actually needed. But I think some people kind of enjoy, for me it's like cutting grass. You just enjoy that repetitive thing and the fact that you've got a job done.
Yep, exactly. Those are pretty good traits. Absolutely. Automation is just mostly a key for a lot of DBAs as they evolve through their career. And the first 5 things we've talked about so far are all stages as you go through it as a DBA. Even for experienced DBAs, these are things you need to get a hold of in order to be effective as your job. But these 5 things that so far we've talked about, these all assume that you have a certain level of knowledge already about some things. And I make certain that I go out of my way that you need to understand. I go out of my way to make sure that people understand some very basic information. So one of the things is just, say, storage. This was actually quite beneficial for me when I was a new DBA, too.
So, gosh, now we're going to do a whole presentation on storage basics?
No, we could. We really could. Let's just say it's important to understand how a database system uses storage and what the trade-offs are, right? The very basics you would need to know are RAID levels because they get discussed a lot. People will say, we're going to do RAID 10. We're going to do RAID 5 for this. We're bringing in a new SAN. The whole thing's going to be RAID 5. Is that good or bad for you as a DBA? So if you don't have some basic knowledge, you don't really know. You don't know enough to stand up and say, actually, could I get a little bit of space reserved for RAID 10 for some of the more complicated systems that rely heavily on 10TB? Maybe that's what you want, right? So if you don't have the basics, then you're not a part of that discussion, not an active part of that discussion. The other basics these days is if you've gone virtual. What's a virtual disk file? What's an RDM, a raw device mapping, right? Which one do you want? So there's a lot of stuff like, is your SAN, are you writing to cache, writing to memory first? How much cache do you have? So little things like that, you've got to make sure that you can get those basics under your belt so you can be an active part of the discussions when the time comes.
One of the things I find interesting about storage basics is for the longest time, we had spinning drives and we learned more and more about those things and the hardware increased and the controllers and all the buses and everything. That technology changed and it changed a little bit about how we thought about them. But today with solid state drives and hybrid drives and in-memory and RAM, I think we've come to a new point in sort of the data world where storage basics are no longer basic, and that this is one of the examples of something that a minimalist DBA needs to really look forward to, like keep looking forward, because it's changing so fast. I'd say for me over the last 3 to 5 years. Would you agree?
Oh, I absolutely do agree, especially with virtualization, and now as we even get into cloud. The understanding of how the data is being stored on disk, and there's a lot of misconceptions and myths as well. Even the fact that when somebody tells me, oh, don't worry, our SAN writes to memory first. It writes to the memory cache. So your disk latencies just simply don't matter. Don't worry about a thing. And you look at them and go, I'm not sure. I think they still do matter. And so if you don't understand just some of the basics, then you're, like I said, you're going to be lost in those conversations. But so you got this, the first part of this talk, we assumed a lot of knowledge, and we really shouldn't. So if you're not up to speed on some of the storage basics, you really should be. Now, as good as knowing this, I think something even more important would be a very basic thing, and that is the difference between high availability and disaster recovery. They are not the same. I can't be any more clear about this.
Yeah.
HA is not equal to DR.
And this could be a whole presentation on its own as well, right?
This absolutely could be a whole presentation. You could fill hours and days of talking about companies that had made this very, very simple mistake of assuming that high availability and disaster recovery were one and the same. I once had a very senior level manager tell me that once he had his HA solution in place, he wouldn't need his DR anymore. And I was just shocked. I'm like, how could you actually make that statement? It just makes no sense to me. If you have a disaster, you won't be able to recover. So new DBAs need to understand the difference and when each is applied. Your job is to be able to recover. High availability doesn't necessarily give you that ability, right? Think about this. If you have an HA solution, right, an HA solution, and a user deletes data, or a corruption happens, or, I don't know, a server guy drops a LUN from the SAN and 3 or 4 servers get wiped out. So when you're in an HA situation, that mistake gets quickly replicated to all the other servers. Yeah. So if you don't actually have, say, a backup that you can recover from, then you can't recover that. If you can't recreate your data store, you can't recover. If you can't recover, you're hosed. So HA and DR are not the same things at all. You've got to be able to understand that. Again, being an active part of that discussion, if somebody ever says, once I have HA, I don't need DR, you've got to stand up and you've got to be clear about what it really means to have a disaster. To me, a disaster means a person can't connect when they want to. That's a disaster. I should fix that.
Yeah, and I think one of the things is that, so high availability, something that fails over and something else takes up the slack, that's all about things being online, is how I think about it. So when my ISP, when my cable goes down, my high availability is just to now hotspot my phone or to drive to Starbucks. Like, those are very manual and long-term process. My disaster recovery is about making sure that I can have data even if I messed up, and it's not about failing over. I guess I could think of it as a type of making sure my data is always available because I have backups. But the inverse, there are still a lot of companies that use only backups and restores as their high availability, right? It just takes a lot longer.
Right.
Because someone has to stand up a new server and restore backups, and sometimes that can take days, depending on how much data there is. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes. And then we also have the issue of, let's say, salespeople trying to pitch high availability solutions as disaster recovery, because it fills a tiny slice of DR. Because if you have another server picking up right away, then you have less of a disaster. But you still might not recover data, right?
That's exactly right. So yeah, it's think about it like automation allows you to get a lot of things done at once. You hope they're all good things, but it also enables you to make mistakes faster than ever before. HA can be the same way. A mistake can be propagated very quickly everywhere. So how do you recover? How do you undo that mistake? that's your DR. That's your recovery plan, and that has to be a factor for any solution.
Yep.
And sometimes it's simple. Oh, I can just reload the data. Okay, well that's great. If that, put it down in writing, that's what you're going to do, and that sounds great to me too. But if the solution is, well, we're going to have to recover the backups from the server tape, well, you just said we didn't need to do backups because we were going to do the HA, right? So you've got to be able to have that discussion and ask those simple questions about how things are going to get done.
Yeah.
So besides, things like storage basics, HA, DR plans, something else that I find useful at a minimum for people, it's standards and documentation. This is actually something that helped me quite a bit. If you don't have it written down somewhere, chances are no one knows what you need or what you're talking about. So when somebody says they need a new database server, as the DBA, you should be able to easily have a vanilla spec of what it is you need for a server. Standard server that you get from Dell or HP or whatever, this many drives, this much RAM, things of that nature. You should have that documented. If there's a SAM backend in your system, you say, okay, when you carve out space in the LUN, I want drives, I want a LUN dedicated for data log backups, things of that nature, and you document all of that. You have to write this stuff down. You want to talk about your SLAs, your service level agreements, your RPO, recovery point objectives, your RTO, the recovery time objectives. You've got to document everything you can and be able to share that information out.
And I think the great thing about standards is some people have high standards or low standards, but everyone has standards, right?
Yeah, everyone has standards.
So, but, as a project manager myself, most people think they do Agile, and Agile says no documentation, right?
Does Agile really say no documentation?
No, it says the right amount of documentation. I think documentation's got such a bad name lately because people think about the way it was in the 80s of you need to sit down and write paragraphs and paragraphs of stuff, when instead, I try to make sure all my documentation is generated as much as possible. So pointing a tool at something and reverse engineering it, or reporting on, collecting all the configuration information about a server or a database and putting that information somewhere, treating it like a configuration database, or at least having it available so that people don't have to hook to production to find out how many tables are there. We could publish that and let people go to that documentation, or to find out where customer data is, or to find out, what's our standard for web servers, and what's our process for virtualizing databases, that kind of stuff.
So, and that's a good point too, because that leads us actually to the next slide. It's actually a great point because we have a slide for that. Is it a standard for you to install everything with SQL Server? Because, SQL Server, Microsoft gives you a whole bunch of stuff, analysis services, report services. Are these things that you will install on your database server as a default?
What's with the chips?
Everything in the bag of chips. All that in the bag of chips.
Oh, I get it. So the whole point about we want to install what we need on the server, not more, maybe kind of looking forward if we know something, other use is going to be on the server. But that means we're Agile, right? Because we're doing just enough database system.
Well, if Agile also means you're just doing enough to keep your job, I guess. I don't know. Agile's just, don't get me, Agile, you know what? You and I should have a whole another hour talk just about Agile. So,
oh, yeah.
I recommend that people do the least possible. I actually used to install everything. I was the person that said, you know what, just install everything, especially production servers, because the mindset was if I ever had to go back and try to reinstall something later, that the change control and the paperwork and everything involved with it was more headache. It was easier for me to just say my vanilla server included all the services. However, I realized over time that that wasn't the best use. All right, it was a little more overhead if they were being used. I could have left them disabled, but it's not really what you wanted, because there's what they say is you increase your surface area of attack. It's more things to go wrong. It's more things you have to patch, right? You want to reduce the number of things you need to fix, patch, and manage. One way to get this done is use of server core. Server core is a great way for you to minimize the amount of things installed on your instance. If you're not using Server Core yet, I actually recommend you try a couple of SQL instances that are installed that are running just on Server Core. And then you can use Management Studio from a different server. I know a lot of people will tell you that they're going to install SQL, they're going to install all the tools with it, everything. They put it all in the box because they need it there when they need it there. And I'm here to tell people you actually don't. You can do just about everything you need remotely. There's very little that you have to do actually on that instance. Very few things where you would say, oh, I need a GUI and I need the tools there. Are there some really odd edge cases? Yep. Does that give you an excuse to treat every server the same and to put full installations of everything on every box? No, absolutely not.
Because
so
one man's set of features is another person's bloatware.
Yeah.
Right? It's like when you get a new PC and it's got all that crap on there, and some of it you might use and 90% of it you might not. But I've heard that Server Core is kind of an advanced thing, that you have to have all these advanced skills in order to work with it.
Well, it's certainly advanced for some people. There's no question about that. They've struggled with it. But this is what I've learned about Server Core. I say Server Core is a great way to keep people off your server that don't belong touching it anyway. So they get there, they see this little command prompt, there's no GUI, there's no buttons for them to click, there's fewer things for them to screw up, and then they leave. They say, you know what, I can't work with this, and that's great. Stay away. I don't want you touching it.
Still point your GUI tools to it, right?
What?
You can still point your GUI tools to SQL Server or anything else that's on there, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yep, you can. And fewer things to check. This is another good point here, but fewer things to check that are installed on the server means less time required to do things like troubleshooting. So at a minimum, you're going to be asked to do some sort of troubleshooting for this server, right? And you don't want to have to check a whole bunch of unnecessary pieces of software. You don't need to think to yourself, oh my God, is this little thing over here actually causing a problem for my instance? There's a lot of components that get installed with SQL Server, especially in the full-blown GUI. And a lot of those little things over time, over the years, you find that one or two things that break, a driver here or there, and all of a sudden, queries either run slow or don't run at all. And these are things that you need.
Is this a recommended book that you're recommending here?
Yeah.
It's updated from Vista.
I think it would be perfect for some people. So, so when it comes to this troubleshooting, the idea is you really want to have some sort of buckets, right? When it comes to troubleshooting, you think about, all right, is it affecting all users or some users? Is it all queries or some queries? Am I looking at things that fall into the buckets of disk, memory, network? Is it CPU? Is it locking, blocking, right? You want to be able to bucketize as much as possible. And in order to do that effectively, you want the minimum number of things that can possibly go wrong with your instance, right? So that the idea of only installing what you need falls in line with this. You have lots of tools available for basic troubleshooting as well. Activity Monitor, querying some DMVs. There's lots of available guidance out on the internet as to how to query some DMVs to pull back some valuable information when you're trying to troubleshoot. Again, something else that we could probably talk about for an entire hour.
Right. Like, I really think troubleshooting is in itself a skill. Like, someone who's good at sort of eliminating possible issues and knowing which things to look at first and which things are applicable to the particular problem, even though we sometimes get that wrong, and those are always great bar stories, I think, or SQL Saturday stories.
Yeah.
And I think that practicing troubleshooting is a really great way of doing it, and only practicing it when there's a production problem makes it a lot harder, don't you think?
Absolutely. You don't want to do your practice when your database is on fire, right? You want to practice your troubleshooting when the pressure isn't on. So, quick question. I just noticed this. We have a timer here that's counting down. Is something going to happen in 20 seconds?
No.
Okay. All right. Never mind.
Just ignore that data.
All right. I'll ignore that data. That's data I don't need. So yeah, the troubleshooting, absolutely. It's a skill. It's something you want to practice. It's something you always want to keep up to speed on. Speaking of which, you always need to keep up to speed on things. You always need to be looking forward to certain things too. So you don't want to be a DBA that sort of sticks to well, a certain comfort zone and never leaves. I say it's ABL. You always be learning, right? One of the best ways at getting better at things like troubleshooting and knowing what to monitor and alert yourself on, all those good things, one of the best way to do that is to simply make an effort to help others. The SQL community is really good at that. We are there to help each other because we've learned that by helping others, we get to learn a lot for ourselves as well. And people want to be aware of the newer features and functionality. Remember earlier I talked about making sure you're doing those backups. Well, you want to know, what are the advances in backups? Like for SQL 2014, I can back up to the cloud now. Is that the right solution for us? Maybe. Maybe it isn't. But it's good to be aware that that's a possibility these days, or just backing up to a URL or whatever it is. Yeah. You need to have the awareness of the new features and functionality that are coming. You always want to be looking forward, and don't stop. Don't just sit down and say, you know what, everything we've got here is great. I don't need those new things. You don't sit down and go, you know what, server core seems too new. I can't do that. I need my GUI. All right? You just don't want to be that. You want to learn something. One of the best ways to learn something is to try to teach it to someone else. All right? I've always found that to be the case throughout my life. When I wanted to get better at something, I simply made an effort to teach. So that's, again, if you want to help others, it's teaching for them a little bit, and it helps you tremendously. I would also point out one other thing. If you're not using it yet, the Windows Azure VMs, that's a great way to get hands-on experience with new technologies. You know, I can build myself an Oracle instance on an Azure VM right now.
Yeah, or any of the NoSQL databases too.
Right. So we've got about 5 minutes left or so. Here's a couple of nuggets for you. So we've talked about a lot of hard skills up to now. Now we're moving into some of the soft skills. So looking forward, this is the learning stuff. This is being aware of new technologies and stuff. But if people left this webinar right here, right now, for the people that are left, right, before you left, right now, if you have one takeaway, right, from this webinar, it would be this. If there was one skill for any DBA to have, new or old, just one thing for you to have, I would tell you it's this. It's empathy. Wow. And it's something that I wish I had more of when I was a younger DBA, and it's a skill that I think I've learned over time. You need to know what motivates your end users. You need to know why they've come yelling and screaming at you. All right? It's not necessarily that you've done something wrong or what. You need to know why. You need to know the business you support. You need to feel their pain, right? Because that way, and you can reflect it back, you can show that you understand their pain points. This is great. If you could do this for somebody, if you have empathy for the people you're working with and sitting in that room with, no matter what they're saying or yelling at you, if you have this empathy, this is going to take you further than probably the other skills we've talked about today. Number one thing I would tell any new or experienced DBA that they need to get more of immediately would be empathy. And this is not the same as sympathy. You don't need to feel sorry for them, although there's plenty of developers that I feel, managers I feel sorry for. But I feel sorry for them because of the pressures they're under, right? I'm not talking about feeling sorry for these people. I'm talking about having empathy for where they are and what they need to get done. Yeah. Go ahead. Did you have something? Or? Okay.
Well, so the thing I try to use is feel people's pain and reflect it back to them. Not throw pain at them, but show them that you understand. Like, developers are under pressure to deliver code fast, and quality isn't always their number one priority, and they're not measured and compensated that. And DBAs want databases to run fast, and data architects want data to be perfect and beautiful and turn into wonderful information, and all of those sometimes are at odds with each other. But if we can't show that we're, that we understand the positions and the constraints we're under, it makes it really hard to move forward.
So we've talked about a lot of things today, a few minutes left, and we've talked about a lot of things for a webinar build as a minimalist, right? But these are the minimum things you need. We didn't say there'd be just a few. We just said these are the bare minimums you need. It's a lot, and this is why DBAs are in high demand. A good DBA is not easy to find because of all the things it takes to be a good DBA. And then the last thing is you need to do no harm, right? I've lost mouse control, so you're going to have to advance the slide, Karen.
Oh, have I? Okay.
I don't know what you've done, but you've taken away control again.
I didn't do anything.
Yeah, you've done something. So if you could advance the slide.
Yeah, okay.
There you go, Zen. Less is more. Listen, observe, find your data. Don't focus on blame, right? You need to have some Zen. I couldn't do a minimalist talk and not talk about Zen, right? You want to find, being calm can make others calm. It's an amazing thing. And don't try to change things that you can't change, like others. You can't change others. You can't change who they are. The only thing you can change is how you react to them.
Yeah. I think this is a really key point. This is something that a skill and an attitude and a practice that I've sort of spent a few decades trying to build up. And it makes a big difference on teams. Like I work on a lot of troubled projects, and being able to have that empathy and always be learning and being proactive and getting just the right of information and doing just the right amount of documentation to help a team, like all of those things together really do come together and make, there's a reason they have to pay you to come to work, because if they didn't pay you, we wouldn't show up a lot of times. But I don't think our projects should be so horrible and people working at cross purposes that we don't feel like a team. And all of the things we've talked about today, really contribute to, focusing on priorities of flying the plane, of making sure that, these are the things that we need to prioritize and work on.
So let's review what we've talked about today. This is everything that we've covered. Quite a lot. Quite a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So most of what we've talked about is operational production DBAs. I would think that there's a similar list for development DBAs and even database designers. Again, probably a whole nother talk for us.
Yeah, hey, that's where I work in the world. So I'd love to think about what are the minimalist tools for a development and design DBA.
So here are the 10 tips. Wait, I don't see them. They're not showing up on my...
Clicking.
Oh, you've done it that way.
Yeah.
You know what? You're going to need to click because it's not responding.
So just don't waste your time alerting. I think the best DBA is a lazy DBA, and by the way, a driven lazy DBA is even better. We can't manage what we don't measure. Otherwise, you're just sort of doing it by, I don't know, telekinesis or something. I don't know. We need to understand the basics of all kinds of things, always be learning and looking forward. And in fact, I did blog these tips on my blog, and one of the things is that, there's a name for the effect of the less you know, the less you realize you don't know. So the more you learn, the more you realize that you don't know, but that makes you a stronger DBA. We have to practice doing things to our database when the database isn't on fire. And this is the hard thing to do when managers and managers are giving you more responsibilities and making it harder for you to do everything, but you need to insist that you have time and tools and access to environments where you can practice troubleshooting, practice recovering, because we said recovery, #1 job. I think writing stuff down is good. It's agile even. I'll put in a plug. Data models are a great place to write stuff down. The more you install, the more you have to manage, and the more can go wrong, so only install what you need. And don't be the guy who panics. Practice and documentation, all these other tips will mitigate all that panic. And empathy is a highly valued trait. Your end users will love you even more and back you up if you show empathy. So we also wanted to share some links to some of the talks and blog posts and articles that we talked about. I want to put that plug in for using Windows Azure VMs for playing with new technology. Just so much faster and so affordable. I did blog today more about the tips. Tom recently blogged about what to do if your database catches fire. That was his Thanksgiving post. Some things on troubleshooting, and a link to Tom's book. And that's all I had. That's all we had. And you guys were great. I loved all the comments. There were a couple of great questions. We'll probably maybe write some more about those and share and try to post some answers to those, I think.
Do you want, I'm looking at them now, I'm wondering if we can,
We got like 1 minute.
well, we got 1 minute. If people want to stick around, I could try to answer them real quick right now.
Sure, I can do that. Hopefully Steve can do that too.
Sure, go ahead.
Any information on running SQL Server when it is on a VM that resides on the SAN would be great. Okay. There's lots of information about it. So are you talking VMware or Hyper-V? You know what I would just tell you to do? I just pick my own product. I just say, hey, if you want information about SQL Server and it's running in VMware, use Ignite VM. That would be my answer to you. Other than that, I would tell you to go to VMware, and you can download some wonderful white papers and best practices guides about it. Honestly, after the VMs, the easiest rule is to try to make it as close to a physical environment as possible. So whatever you would do for physical, try to do that for virtual, and then go from there. You can adjust from there. Sam does my backups. All right. We have backup restoration engineers. They use net backup. Any strengths, weaknesses I need to be aware of as a DBA. So I would tell you that what you want to do there is, it'd be key for you is to test the process. So I can't tell you what strength or weakness you need to be aware of because I don't know what the real process is there, except that somebody else is doing it and they're using net backup. So if I were you, I would just say, figure out what your needs are. What's your SLA? Do you need to be able to recover to like a point in time within a 15-minute window of the day, whatever that is. But you simply say, I need to recover to Tuesday at 3 p.m. And either they can do it for you or they can't. And if it's something you needed, figure out why. So test the process as much as possible. Just think of something crazy and just say, I'm asking for it. Either you can do it or you can't. Either it meets the SLA or it doesn't. Test, test, test. Some vendors provide tools. What do you think about SQL Audit to monitor activity on a production server? I think SQL Audit is a fine tool to monitor activity if that's what you need. Depends on what you're trying to monitor. So SQL Audit is one of those things where you're trying to check on like who's accessing a table or who's actually in the database. It's not going to help you tell you a thing about CPU utilization. So it depends on what the word activity means in your question there. But I think SQL Audit is a fine thing. I wouldn't tell you to audit everything. I would tell you to figure out what it is you need audited and to do the bare minimum. If you set up an audit to just capture everything, I think you're asking for a little more overhead than you need. Alerts don't necessarily require action investigation. To me, investigation is action. So I see that as one. I don't know how I can investigate in an inactive manner. Karen, is that possible?
So I think investigation is a perfect, it's a possible problem. It's a possible issue. So when I say action, I do consider investigation and action. That's our job, is to find out, hey, we think this could be a problem. Is it actually a problem, or is it just, a really, really busy day or some one-off maintenance job that's causing slowdowns? We just need to know.
So, and the last part of it says, I alert on success so I know it completed and isn't just running endlessly. So, I got a better idea. How about you put a check-in at, how long should it take? Should it take an hour? Then at 90 minutes, put a check-in and say, let me check and make sure it's done.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, to me, I don't want to be interrupted that things are good. Things should be good. I don't care that it completed successfully. That's the way it should work. If it's running long, you have a check somewhere in there to say, it's running long.
Yeah.
Now that requires action or investigation. So.
Yeah. I do, for instance, I do have reports from systems that I support that I can go look up to see, that it's all green, all the backups completed successfully. I just don't need to be alerted of it. I just want to be, I just want to be alerted of the exceptions because that's all that I have time to manage. This doesn't mean I don't collect data about successful stuff. And I think that's the nuance here.
Right.
I need to know that things happened correctly. And I want to review a report usually in the morning, usually not 3, usually closer to 9, that everything did well, but I don't want to have my phone buzzing or whatever it is that I get my alerts to, or a phone call just because something went wrong.
Yeah, so in my experience, what I've seen is people simply say, "Oh, so at 9:15 this was successful," and then they know something else is coming, and then they get an alert, "Oh, at 9:20 this was successful," and I look. I'm sorry, I don't want to be interrupted by that. I need to know of failure. I need to know when I actually have to investigate something, right? That is the idea of an alert. If you're just being alerted because, hey, yeah, everything's great, to me, that has zero value. I want no part of it. If that works for you, that's great. Enjoy that part of your life. I want no part of that. Do not interrupt me to tell me that everything is going great. I just assume greatness, I guess.
Yeah. So there's a great question there, Tom, about from Jose that says, when you said test your backups, how do you test it when your database is huge? Do you test log backups only? This is a question that I run into a lot.
So I would tell you there's two things. So the article I wrote over at Simple Talk is about statistical sampling. So I can just grab, in my case, it was about 35, 39 random databases. And the question of size was one of them. Because what if I happen to, at a random pull, grab the one that was 1 terabyte? And the way I look at it is, well, I'm probably not grabbing that 1 terabyte every time I do my random sample. So, you know what? It might not be a bad thing to simply test. Because what if I didn't have space for that? I mean, it's a large database. So if the question is, hey, the database is huge, and I don't have a place to do a test restore because I don't have enough space, I would tell you that's a problem. And that's probably something you want to remedy. So even though the database is huge, my goal for a successful test is I have a backup. Here's this backup. Is it good or not? And that means I restore it. And if that means, I wouldn't tell you I'm just testing a log backup because you apply a log to the full. I mean, I'm going to test the backup. So usually my testing always involved the full backup. It wasn't testing a differential or transaction log being applied. It was always so there's another, before that, what do you use to monitor that the agent is running? So I put together some script a long time ago that simply, it could query, I think inside of one of the DMVs, sys processes or something, I could simply query to see if the agent was running. I forget the message we looked for. But then I moved on to Operations Manager, which would tell me if the agent was up and running. And these days I can use Ignite to simply tell me that if the agent was up and running. Another tool I could use would be SolarWinds. SolarWinds Application Manager actually would work there as well. Somebody finished my book. You're the one. Excellent. Thank you. I have a database that replicates itself from jobs. What should be backed up, master? Is that enough? I'd back up the database as well as your system databases. Jose, lazy, virtual machines in relation to, what about virtual machines in relation to storage? I don't know. What about it? Not sure I understand enough about the question, so Steve's around me. You can tell us more.
Like the person is looking for tips or guidance on that, and that does sound like a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Maybe
another skill to work on, negotiation, more empathy, excellent point. Thank you. How much DBA should to know about Windows? Well, no, I mean, it's a good question. You should know, how much should you know? You should definitely be familiar with it. There's no question about that. You should be able to install Windows. You should be able to configure Windows. For a DBA, a lot of times, that's things like punching holes in the firewall. So if the Windows firewall is on and that's your default method of protecting your servers, you're going to need to know how to open up some ports to let people in to do some activity, like query a database server. You don't need to know everything about Windows, but you're going to find fairly quickly there's a few things you're going to need to become familiar with just to make sure your database server is up and running. So that's essentially how much you need to know. But I can't tell you, I can't list it out for you exactly off the top of my head because it actually kind of varies on your environment. Some people aren't allowed to touch the OS at all, so it wouldn't matter what they know because they would always have to simply ask somebody else to help.
I think also security is probably a good thing, to understand how Windows security and SQL Server security and how they all work together. I think that's important.
Yeah, that's a good one too. So difference between an administrator for the instance of SQL Server and an administrator for the server itself, a local admin as we call it. Yeah, that would be a good one. Can you go back to the previous slide? No. Glad you joined.
Hey
Can you show
guys,
the links again? Oh, you're doing that. Okay.
guys, we've got to wrap it up
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
in
yeah.
the next minute or two. So
We only got a few more questions.
go ahead and finish your minute.
I think I've answered a lot of them in the chat, in the Q&A.
So, okay, I'll work from the bottom. Is virtualizing SQL Server a good idea? Yes. How much should you know? All of it. Thanks. How to set up a RAID for a VM? Well, depends on what you need there, but you're probably going to want to set up, ideally you'd have different levels of RAID, but if you're backed by SAN, you might find your SAN admin simply says RAID 5 for everything because it's easier for them. I second the idea of a webinar for indexes and integrity. Well, Karen has no integrity. Slides. Other than PowerShell, is there a language or platform that you would recommend?
Whatever your corporate standard is.
Yeah, whatever the corporate. C#, actually. I'd tell you C#. I'm not going to go into detail about high availability right now. We'll have to do a whole other talk about that. If somebody wants to email, that's Tan. If Sam wants to email me, maybe I can answer that offline. An alert that causes action is better than an alert that requires action. All right. And how much memory does SQL need? All of it.
More.
I think that's it.
Yep.
Well, I really appreciate it. You guys have been wonderful, and I think you're the first ones to ever finish all the questions too. So that's pretty impressive.
Well, you know, what we like to do is get it done while we're here. Less work for us later.
That makes sense. It kind of lends itself to the topic. Well, one thing I have left to do is give away the Amazon card for $50, and that goes to, let's see, I had it selected here, Noel Spencer. I've got his email address, and we'll get it to you in the next few days.
All right.
And just wanted to thank Tom and Karen again, and we'll have another presentation on January the 7th. I'm hoping you can hear me now. Apparently my
Yep.
sound is not very good, but anyway, we want to thank all of you for attending. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.